Good evening and welcome to yet another stream from me, Amedeo Beretta. The channel is Animation Pandemic. You can watch the stream on YouTube and Twitch if you want. Now I stream every Thursday at 5 p.m. UTC, so maybe you should set a reminder if that is of interest to you. And today's subject will be school marks and degrees, which is a subject that I have a special interest in because I do work in education for most of the time nowadays. And I've been teaching in universities for a fairly long time already. Hi there, hi everybody, thank you very much for joining us today. I'm just saying hi to the people in the chat, and remember you can ask questions or contribute in English or Italian and in Spanish as well. I think I can handle that too, so feel free to intervene, there is no problem at all. So school marks, degrees and so forth. Now just yesterday I was doing some examinations in an Italian university I teach at, and I always ask people what do they plan to do after university, and a lot of people, they plan to go to a master degree or to an animation school, and of course they are worried whether their animation school or the other university they are going to move on to is good enough for their professional development. And very often they are worried whether that degree is good enough for professional development, as in, if I get that degree, will the studios I want to work with consider me more than other people? So for instance, if I study at the school of super animators, at the University of the Super Animators, will the studios value my professionality more or less? And the answer is that it probably won't matter to any studio which school you attended. There are of course some situations and some contingencies. For instance, there are some universities that, or some colleges that in time became very, very famous, and their graduates were particularly good. So of course, after you get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people out of that school, and the school delivers consistent talent, then of course the studios, animation companies and so forth will be more likely to believe that if somebody graduated from that university, this somebody might be good enough to work. They may be talented or very professionally prepared. That's something that does happen. However, one has to keep in mind that universities, like studios, they go in waves, right? There are some times in which it is very good to work in a studio. It makes for a very good experience, and then there are some times in which maybe the studio is not as well organized because they just expanded very quickly, and working in that company is not particularly good. There are some projects that are more prestigious than others, and similarly it goes for the universities. Sometimes there is a university who maybe wasn't worth anything in the professional world. Nobody knew about this university, and then all of a sudden, maybe, or more realistically, gradually, some graduates come out, they are of good quality, and the university makes a name for themselves. In which case, of course, that means that the studios, when they hear the name of the university, they tend to associate that to the level of their students. That's usually something that does happen. However, that does not mean that going to that specific university will make you an appealing candidate if you want to work in a company, because it's a good thing of the industry, in fact, that in order to get a job, usually you need to prove that you can do that job. That means usually a portfolio or a showreel or any sort of proof that is relevant to the job that you need to do. In fact, we could probably call it a night and just say that marks have no value whatsoever in the industry. Nobody in their healthy state of mind will ever ask you what was your mark in, I don't know, an animation module about acting. It would be insane. And that's because the correlation between a mark and the quality of your animation is not necessarily a linear one. And maybe you can get a very good mark and your animation may not reflect that. I mean, maybe your animation is not of professional grade just because you got a good mark. So I think that's something worth mentioning. I should also mention that since I'm still teaching in higher education and I teach in universities and colleges, my opinion does not represent that of my employers. So I don't mean to offend anybody. I'm just speaking out of experience here, and the truth is nobody in the industry will ever ask you for your school marks. If they do, well, I would be curious to meet them and to know why they asked and what's the context, because of course there must be some context there. In general, the only thing that matters as an animator is your showreel, and whether you are a person who we find ourselves at ease to work with, whether do we find comfortable working with you, do we feel like you are dependable, do we feel like we can work with someone without having to constantly check on them. Of course, if you work with a junior, you're kind of expected to check on them. That's the whole point, right? They're building the skills, they're building their experience, so it is normal that a junior will be checked upon. But again, that is irrelevant of their formation. It doesn't really matter which school you go to, for as long as your animation is of good quality. That's pretty much it. I could probably hit stop right now and stop streaming, because I don't think you really need to add much more than that. At the same time, marks are there. Marks are, as far as I read around, marks are a pretty new thing, as in, I think that we're talking about the 18th century, more or less, for a systematic framework for marking people. I don't think, or as far as I read, any earlier than that, you don't have that much that approach to marking. So I think it's a relatively new thing that we try as a species, I guess, in order to figure out a way to classify people and their productivity or their efficiency in doing something, I guess. So I think another thing that is worth understanding is that there are some universities, there are some places where marks are not even, let's say, how should I put it down? So there are some universities and some places where the mark you receive is not even something that it depends only on your tutor, for instance. That's something that is worth understanding as well. So I mean, now even just randomly checking the internet, I go to this website, the University of Exeter, and they have an entire chapter about peer and self-assessment in student work, meaning that it's possible for students to mark their fellow classmates, or for yourself as a student to mark yourself. And this is a notion that, where I come from, is completely frowned upon. The idea that a student is able to evaluate themselves is considered laughable in certain places, but it has been studied for a long time, and there is some validity to self-assessment in many ways. However, I'm probably going to discuss that a little bit later, but I was Googling around, and you see there are even University of Reading. There is the use of peer and self-assessment. It seems to be pretty widespread in the English-speaking world. I think there needs to be, again, some sort of disclaimer in here, for which one needs to understand whether this self-marking, so let's say that you go to uni and you deliver a piece of animation, and then the tutor asks you, what do you think of it? Now, and maybe they tell you what's the mark you would give yourself, and put it in this form, please. Now, in some universities, the mark you give on that form is contributing to your actual mark in that subject topic. So in practice, if you mark yourself with a very high mark, and the tutor marks yourself with another marks you with another mark, the two marks are now in competition, or rather they are averaging themselves. Now, many universities, they have a moderation system for which this, of course, if you give yourself 100 out of 100, the tutor is going to intervene and ask you at least to motivate that, and then they're probably moderating that self-mark so that it doesn't get ridiculous, of course. But imagine that you are giving yourself a mark which is reasonable, so it's a reasonable mark, and your classmates are giving you a mark which is also reasonable. So these marks are not going to be moderated, and they're going to be contributing to the mark of your module, the one that tutor gave you. On top of that, very often there is external examiners checking that everything is in order, that there is a certain system for marking people. But you can imagine that if the mark you give yourself and the mark the classmates give yourself is contributing to your mark on a specific subject, you can imagine that nobody outside the school is going to consider the mark as a reliable indication of the quality of your work. Because outside in the let's say commercial world, the employers or even clients are interested in getting a specific thing done, a specific product out of the door, of course. So whether your classmates gave you a very high mark for your work, or you gave yourself a very high mark of your work, it is of no relevance whatsoever to anybody outside that classroom, I think. So it's however, having said that, there is a utility to self-assessment, I think. I mean, if we go beyond, of course, the mark itself, one has to understand, for instance, that when you receive a mark in the university academic jargon, that mark is considered to be summative assessment. That means that we sum up whatever you've done so far, and you're given some sort of objective indication, a number that gives you an idea of where you score on a ladder between 0 or 100, or whichever range you have depending on the nation you study at. That is a mark that you receive at the end of your module. It's like saying, look, this is what I think of your work, more or less, or rather, more professionally. Based on the framework that the university gives us, upon which we are going to mark you, and after having checked the learning outcomes that we expected of you during this module, this is how you score. This is more or less how you can expect to be marked in a university. The problem with summative assessment is that it happens at the end of your study, at the end of a module, for instance. So it is not particularly useful for you as a matter of feedback. You can only evaluate things that happened, and that's it. The industry doesn't quite work that way. When you are given a shot to animate, the feedback you receive is constant and as early as it can be. And that kind of feedback is considered to be formative assessment in terms of jargon again. So in university, you will find formative and summative assessment, and formative is the assessment that you receive on a daily basis when you talk to your tutor or professor and they tell you, look, this thing works, this thing doesn't work. Formative assessment is way more important than summative assessment. The opinion of someone who is skilled at what they do and who are trying to give you a feedback to the effect of improving your work is way more important than a number you receive at the end of the same assignment telling you from 0 to 100 you scored 55. Well, thank you very much. If you would have gone to a different university, you would have gotten a different number. that's maybe a consolation to some, but it's also the confirmation that marks can range wildly. I mean, if you go to Italian universities, marks used to be fairly low 10-15 years ago, very low. It was particularly difficult to get a super high mark in a lot of university. You couldn't quite get to the top most of the time, and they would use the whole ladder. I mean, you could get the university marks in Italy went between 0 and 30. I got a 5 out of 30 on in one examination once, so you could get pretty low marks. While, for instance, in a lot of English-speaking nations, in my experience, well, let's not talk about my experience about a lot of nations because I only taught in the UK, but if I think about the UK, it is relatively rare to get a mark which is really, really low, because of course the learning outcomes are structured in such a way that students are supported to meet those learning outcomes. In Italy, for instance, the situation is historically fairly different. So again, if the numbers are ranging so much between universities and between nations, then that must be an indication that the marks are useful, possibly in the context of your university, but not particularly outside, because there isn't a standard. So in the chat, in the meantime, we have a comment. They say, coming out of undergraduate, what are some must-have skills for an animation rigger students should keep in mind? Of course, if you just undergraduated and you are, it really depends. Animation and / rigger, you're almost a generalist. You want to decide what you want to do. I think in terms of, if you want to do animation rigging, I would expect certainly that you could script in Python, so that if need be, you can make your rig repeatable easily, and also create animation tools if need be. This would be for a generalist who wants to do both animation and rigging. I think Python scripting needs to be a must at this stage. That is not to say that if you don't have that skill, you won't be hired anywhere, of course. But in general, I think that if you have that skill, people will look at your portfolio, read your skills, and they will say, you know what, if the animation is good, and then if you can also script in Python and you can rig and you can demonstrate on the showreel that you rig, then you come across as a pretty solid candidate, I would say. And Morpai in the chat is saying that once they got 1 out of 10 in their high school, good times. And in fact, that's another thing. I mean, in Italy, for instance, the marks in the high school I went to officially went between 0 and 10. But nobody ever gave us anything higher than 8. It was practically impossible to get an 8 until there was a reform in the school system, and the government essentially asked schools to use the full range, and suddenly people, including me, people started getting 9. And after a few years I left school, there was another reform. Actually, no, I think there was last year I was at school, there was another reform for which now you could get the end result of the exam in high school could go up all the way to 100. So it was rated between 0 and 100. And that meant that in order to get there, people had to receive marks like 10 in high school. And all of a sudden, the people that left high school left with super high marks. Whereas 1 year before, nobody could have ever gotten there. And if you weren't careful, you could interpret that statistics as if the students coming out 1 or 2 years after me were incredibly talented if compared to the students of my generation, which is again one more reason not to believe in marks, or rather not to get too hooked up on them, because they're just a number at the end of the day, and they're used to compare you against a benchmark somewhere. So there is a utility to that. In fact, if we go back for a second to the assessment, we were saying summative is numbers and formative is instead something like a feedback on what you did. There is earlier on we were also talking about self-assessment, right? The concept that a student give themselves their own mark. Now, of course, that is a bit interesting as a concept, and much depends on the way it's implemented. But there is a situation in which giving yourself, well, as you talk to your instructor, tutor, or professor, giving yourself some sort of assessment, although not a mark maybe, is considered useful. So for instance, I was watching some sort of documentary about EasyJet pilots training on YouTube. I was watching this thing, and it came to my mind that I was checking captains training first officers, and to my mind, I noticed that after a landing, the person with more experience can may and will ask the person with less experience, the one who did the flight and the landing, what do they think about the landing? And the reason why they asked about whether the landing was a success or not and what didn't work and what worked is because they want to understand whether the person who performed the task is aware of whether something went wrong or if everything went fine, and how objective they are about the situation. So in that respect, a student marking their own job, their own work, is actually a very good thing. I mean, not in terms of giving themselves a number, but in terms of evaluating their work and saying, you know what, I think that animation works, the other animation doesn't work, that area of the animation doesn't work as well as I wished it was, and I could have improved this and that. And now you all of a sudden you start a conversation with your tutor, with your professor, or with your supervisor, with the client, whoever, or even with yourself if you're honest enough. And now you can finally discuss whether something is working or not and what could be improved. I noticed that when you're trained to fly a plane and they ask you whether you think that that heavy landing you just made was okay and how it came into being, I noticed that they are really interested in understanding whether you're going to say, oh, it was a good thing, everything went fine, or not. Because if your reaction is defensive, as in, oh, the landing was amazing and you just crashed, but you're saying the landing went fine, then of course that means you're not fit for piloting an aircraft that in which there are other lives at risk, for instance, in which case they won't let you fly anymore, probably, unless you change your attitude. So that kind of assessment is in fact very valuable because it develops a critical eye in the person who's giving their own self-assessment. So I would rather, if you are worried about school marks, I would rather focus instead of self-assessment and doing that with the presence of someone who is very professional and very experienced. That's how you learn. You start a conversation about the topic on which you wish to receive some sort of grading without having to get to the number, of course. And the fact that in general nobody really asks you for a degree as well. So they're in the industry anyway. So sometimes I had people in the past actually asking me in the chat whether I think that in order to animate professionally, you need to have a degree at a uni, for instance. That's something that I think it's a reasonable question to have, in fact. And the answer to that is that you don't really need, there is no objective need for a diploma or a degree or any piece of paper proving that you could animate. For as long as you can read and write and that your animation is of very good level, then you're fit for purpose, I would say, and the industry thinks pretty much that way. And this is something I actually quite like about our industry, is that for as long as you can do your job and you're good at animating, you have good eye for animation, and of course you're relatively pleasant to work with. And if you're given something to do, one can count on the fact that you will do your best, then you can work. You do not need a degree. So you shouldn't really quite worry about that. And in my opinion, you shouldn't go to university just because they have a very good name or they have made a very good name for themselves. Well, that may be true, of course. That may be true. They may have a good name because they are very good at teaching you stuff. And when you leave, of course, you're very good. But, it's the student that learns. So you can't bestow knowledge on someone who's not even willing to receive it, or is not trying to process that knowledge. And the simple fact of going to class won't give you the ability to animate or rig or do anything, in fact. So the name of university may mean something. It may be concurrent with the quality of the teaching and the quality of the students, or it might not be. And you always have to check whether that's true or not. So in general, you have to ask the university how many hours of class do you have, which kind of modules you're being taught, by whom. And then you go and check the teacher's LinkedIn to check maybe what's the level of experience, if they have any class recorded online or any feedback session recorded online. You want to maybe check that to see if it's a fit to you. Because, for instance, there is a cultural difference in the way feedback is delivered. I mean, we talked about that in one of my other lives about feedback, if you think of it. So, for instance, in England, when you answer no to a question, you usually say no, I don't, no, you don't, no, it can't be done, no, you wouldn't do that way. The no, this denial signal, is almost never uttered alone. You never say no, and that's it, because that sounds pretty harsh in the English language. However, in Italy, you say no and yes without following with some sort of sweetener usually. So my feedback, especially at the beginning, was just no. And then I would go on maybe explaining why the no came into being. The problem was that my students who were less used to international relationships, so to speak, or cultural diversity, would take that no as a harsh no, as if I was almost pissed off. So again, that's why you want to see the kind of feedback that a tutor delivers, because of course maybe you're sensitive enough to be annoyed by someone just saying no, like I would do, for instance. So that's also a good idea, I think, to check before you go to school, see who the instructors are. And that's something a lot more relevant than the name of the university, of course. I think it's good to think in those terms. It helps probably. Another thing I would do, if you really are worried about whether the degree is good or not, is check the showreels of the students. And when they leave, what's their showreel? Do they get hired, for instance? And try to find a showreel that is as close as it can be to graduation. So a showreel that the school is responsible for. And that's not even enough. You really want to go and check maybe the LinkedIn, if they have any, and see if before going to uni or to that animation school they had maybe another showreel, an older one, and whether you want to check whether that showreel maybe is of quality which is dramatically lower than the one they had after school, because sometimes there are people who are already quite good but they don't feel confident enough, so they go to yet another school, and in that school they develop even more and they leave with a very good showreel, but that doesn't mean that the showreel is something that is generated by the school itself, of course. So that's another thing that you really want to keep in mind. So there's in the chat someone says that they think that school is a good place to network, and I think that's a very good point. In fact, the school is a place where you can build a network more than anything else, and also a place that can be used to sort of foster some discipline, to keep some discipline. If you work within an environment where deadlines are given and there is some sort of pressure, then of course a lot of people are more motivated by that. And someone from the 19th century could have said maybe that without pressure you can't have any diamonds, right? The idea being that carbon needs to be undergoing an extreme amount of pressure before it originates a diamond. And I think there is some truth to it. If you're given a deadline, and if you find yourself in that situation for which you have a day after which your effort is sort of in vain, then of course you're motivated a lot more. And the presence of other people in the same class or in other classes, people you can talk to, is extremely important, especially if they can suggest maybe different approaches to the same task or different techniques. So there is a value in school in that sense. But again, you see, it has essentially nothing to do with marks. If you, of course, exclude the situation for which marks can be used as a threat, right? If you don't deliver by the deadline, or if your animation is not good enough, then you get a low grade. That means you don't pass that module. So if you leave it that way, of course, that is a threat, which for some people is the amount of pressure they need to perform. So in that sense, the mark could potentially be seen as a good thing. I do wonder, however, whether we just got used to need a mark in order to perform, or whether it's something that is genuinely healthy. That thing I don't know. I think we should probably ask some psychologists whether to see whether that is a true thing or not. There is another aspect to schools which I noticed is quite important, and that is the relationship with your tutor. The problem being that your tutor, of course, may have a lot of experience, so you would benefit from being around someone with a lot of experience, obviously, because they can teach you a lot of stuff. So if their way of working is good enough, then and their way of teaching is even better, then of course being near this person and learning from them is valuable. It's actually very, very useful. However, I've noticed that some of my students, for instance, they believe that the tutor or the professor might hold the keys to their professional success. And I don't know how much truth there is to it, to be honest. Well, it is true that if your tutor is professional and well connected with the industry network, for instance, and your animation is amazing, it is true that this person can hold some influence over your professional development. For instance, when they hear from their professional network, then we are looking for animator in the industry, for instance, then they may say, you know what, I know just the guy that you could find useful. So in that case, of course, the tutor, the professor, does hold the keys to your professional development. Maybe. That is provided, of course, that the tutor or the professor do understand what is it that you want to do. So I remember once I found myself in a room with some colleagues, and the news came that one of the students who graduated from the uni refused or rather declined the job offer at a very famous animation studios. And in the room, the mood was generally unanimous about this. The student should have accepted, they said. And I don't know, I didn't think exactly the same thing, because I knew the student, although in passing, we weren't very close, of course. And I realized that because I could see their work, and I realized that the student was not interested, for instance, in animation from the standpoint of animating shots in a feature film. So if the company offered that to them, although it was their first job, I think they were well within within an acceptable level of sanity to decline the offer. And in fact, maybe they wanted to do more of I don't know, the pre-production of the animation. Maybe they wanted to do previs, for instance, or they wanted to do cinematography for animation, who knows. And soon enough, they would have found something because the material was good enough in there. And in fact, it happened that way. The person went exactly where they wanted to go. So I think there is something to be said about being driven and wanting to do something specifically and having good material to support that desire. And the tutor may think instead, they may have a different philosophy to the approach of employment and working on your discipline. Maybe for some people, you don't really have to go specifically in one direction. Maybe a foot through the door can be more important than a foot through the specific door you want your foot in, for instance. And in some cases, that is true, in my opinion. You can actually consider that as a valid approach. However, if you're very determined about something and you have the skills and you put the work there to support that desire, then there is no reason to believe that you shouldn't be a bit picky about what you want to do. Within reason, of course. You always have to evaluate your situation in the context of where you stand. Maybe you have no autonomy, you need to work now, otherwise you can't pay the rent. And in that case, beggars can't be choosers. You have to kind of take whichever come if you are in a situation of dire necessity. Of course, you should try to avoid that situation, of course. But that is to say that a tutor may even be well connected and may even somehow open some doors to you. But if those aren't the doors you are interested in, then of course they are of no use to you. And that's something you need to consider as well. So it's not because there's a professor with a lot of experience or a tutor, or even if I tell you to work somewhere and you're my student, you shouldn't do that just because I said so. You have to evaluate your situation. So the tutor is there to provide you with advice and guidance, and this advice and guidance is based on their experience of life and on the profession and on professional experience as well, of course. But you shouldn't be taking anything that anybody says as gold, as just pure gold. You are the interpreter of reality, because the way you deal with your own reality affects you primarily. Of course, it affects other people as well, but in this case, we are talking about your development. So you should, in Italy, for instance, they say that you should listen to all the bells and then decide what you think of what you just heard. That is to say, you should listen to whichever advice come your way, and then decide based on your situation what you think is the best course of action. And there is nothing to substitute that. There is little consolation in, for instance, complaining about the fact that you followed somebody's advice and now you find yourself in a situation you don't enjoy because that was the case. You may be right, of course. Maybe that was ill advice, for instance. But at the same time, you decide to follow that, and that means that somehow you neglected your own point of view over it if you just blindly accepted it. So in my opinion, you shouldn't, in general, blindly follow the advice of anybody, I would say, not even if they are presented as the ultimate authority in anything. Because you have to check your situation, of course, and you don't know exactly what's the background of a person. I mean, why some people say something and some people say something else. Some people are enthusiastic truly about what they do, so they will tell you that the stuff they do is the best stuff that you could possibly do in your life. Some people may be embittered by the very same subject, and they may tell you not to go that way because it sucks. And who is right and who's wrong? They would probably both think they're right. So that means that eventually it comes down to you as an individual to decide what's the way, right? What's the way to happiness for you? I imagine that would be the thing. Now, some students in my experience are very reverential towards tutors because they think that pissing the tutor off, for instance, may be something that could compromise their professional development. Maybe that's true. I don't know. I guess that if you piss somebody off, they will be less inclined to teach you to transmit valuable information, right? And they may close off a little. Having said that, a professor or a tutor are there for that very purpose. They are paid indeed to transmit that valuable information. So if they stop transmitting because they are pissed off at you for whichever reason, then they are not being professional, and that's about it. And if, let's say that you have created a difficult situation with your tutor or your animation teacher, it's unlikely that this person will go out of their way just for the purpose of ruining your professional development. If they go into the industry and say, you know what, don't hire this person because we are in bad terms. I mean, anybody with a grain of salt hearing something like this will, first of all, doubt the validity of what they just hear, of course. Then, of course, that doesn't mean that you should go around and deliberately pissing your tutor off. It just means that, in general, you shouldn't be overly concerned about, for instance, holding a different opinion than the one of your tutor. For as long as that opinion is informed, of course. If you're debating whether an arc of an animation is properly tracked or not, for instance, I mean, there is a debate to be had in there, and there is no reason to push forward your arguments for as long as you have grounds to support those. So you should, in my opinion, treat tutor professors just like people who might have more experience than you in certain situations and in certain aspects, but they're still people, so you can have a conversation with them and you can see what's good in life, so to speak. Conan the Barbarian would have an answer to what's good in life, right? So do not feel under the pressure when you are in school of not being able to express your opinion. And I have to say that, for instance, in Italy, in university, I think there used to be historically a lot of pressure when students had to deal with professors. I don't think that students felt they could speak freely with professors in Italy. And I think in the UK, for instance, where I teach now most of the time, the situation is a lot better, and the relationship between teachers and students in a university is a lot closer than it was in the universities that I attended in Italy. I mean, in Italy, I had a number of teachers, an immense amount of them, and I probably spoke to one or two, and maybe I spoke in relatively friendly terms with one. And in fact, there was a specific one that used to provide me with a certain amount of advice, which was life related. I mean, I had one professor in university. It's worth me noting that when I left high school, I left an art high school, and then I enrolled onto aerospace engineering because I thought, A, I wanted to fly planes, and B, engineering is quite a good job, and I am interested in things more than people very often. And then I left after the first term because me and engineering really had not much in common. I don't think I had the discipline in me to deal with numbers in an objective way in practice. And I moved on to another university, which was closer to cinema, which I was interested in, but not particularly closer to CG, for instance. It was more of a humanities university. And I remember that in the meantime, I was studying animation and I was trying to build a showreel until eventually I did have a showreel. And I remember I went to, and it had nothing to do with that university, of course. And I went to the coordinator of that course, which was a professor of mine, and I received a job offer at that time, and I was still in uni. And I asked this person whether he thought that it would be a good idea to just leave uni for the time being and go work in what I wanted to do, which was animation. And I remember this tutor looking at the room full of students and telling me, look, I mean, these students may not know what they want to do next. You know what to do next, what you want to do next, what would make you happy. At least you think so. So you should definitely leave. And if one day you want to come back to uni and finish it, I have no doubt you could finish it. And I mean, I would have left anyway, I have to admit, but having someone within the university telling me that was really, really comforting in a way. I thought, you know what, that I'm not crazy. I mean, it seems to me that there is a reason for me to think that I should leave and go animating. And it happened exactly the same way the professor told me. I went animating, I was really, really happy. And at a certain point, I came back and I finished university after a few years. That probably accounts for the longest degree ever, because it took me something like 8 years or so to do an undergraduate degree, right? Because I started and then after 1 year or so I dropped out again, and then I went animating professionally, and after a few years I came back again. So again, I mean, if I had been worried about the degree, I would have found myself locked for 3 years into university, in which I was studying stuff that I really enjoyed studying, by the way. I think that a formation in humanities does have value, but professionally speaking, it wasn't what I wanted to do. So that was something that really helped me as a person, I think. And there is a question in the chat, and the question is, do people in the industry care if you did an online degree? That's an extremely good question, by the way. Thank you, Hoodrat Paco. The answer is they couldn't care less. If you did, I mean, unless of course you're buying one of those degrees for which you pay and you get a piece of paper, the industry does not care less where you studied for as long as you can do the job. Now, there are some situations, don't get me wrong, there are some situations in which school marks and degrees do have a value. But you have to keep in mind that those situations are more, you should consider them situations in which that value is agreed upon by convention. There is no objective value yet in the degree, but by convention we decide that a degree and a specific school mark is needed. Think of a scholarship, for instance. Many times you can't access a scholarship unless you either are in a particular economical situation. For instance, maybe you are living under the threshold of poverty, and that's one of the criteria. And sometimes when I was getting some information on my own, because of course I had to pay my own university, so I was always checking whether there was a way to get some scholarship somehow. Sometimes the scholarship was subject to marks. If you didn't have marks high enough, you couldn't get the scholarship, for instance. So in that case, marks were relevant. Again, however, they didn't mean anything whatsoever, because, I mean, the scholarship didn't test whether you knew the subjects on which you received good marks. They just checked if on a piece of paper you had those marks. If you had those marks, then you were eligible. So that's one situation in which marks are useful, but again, you see there is no objective values in marks even in that situation, apart from the criteria. So you might say that, well, if you can learn what you want to learn, the stuff that you want to learn, say animation, and get good marks in the meantime, well, maybe there's a use to that, and maybe you should try to get good marks. But you should always try, in my opinion, to get good marks through learning the discipline you want to learn, not as a means, as a means to an end, if you see what I mean. Another situation in which a degree may be useful, and an online degree in particular, is something that you have to evaluate. Some nations have immigration systems which are point-based. That is, they evaluate your file, and based on the experience that you have, the academic qualifications that you have, they give you points. And once you reach a certain threshold, I'm simplifying greatly here, then you are eligible to immigrate to that specific country. And in some countries, having a degree which is recognized by that country is considered positive. It means you have enough points maybe to move maybe 1 or 2 steps higher, in which case a degree is indeed useful. But again, we're talking about another convention. We have decided that a degree means that you are more eligible than others as an immigrant, for instance. Maybe you just bought that degree, we will never know, but yet it has a relevance there. And some online degrees are not recognized. So I remember at a certain point I found myself having to decide to take a master degree, because if you work in higher education, sometimes your employer may ask you to get a higher qualification, a higher academic qualification. And I remember that I was looking for, I wanted to study a specific subject. I thought, you know what, if I have to take another degree, which I don't really want to, because I don't think a piece of paper is necessarily something that makes me a better person, then it might as well be something that skill-wise I can benefit from, something that I can learn something from. So I was checking some very good online courses, I thought, and I even wrote the school, and it turned out that the school, those master degrees were not recognized by the nation I was working in. So in practice, doing that degree wouldn't have been found useful by my employer, which was really a pity, because I thought that my employer would have greatly benefited from me having more skills rather than me having a piece of paper. But hey, it's the way it is. The employer by convention decided that the only available master that one could take would be one which was recognized, and I had to go for one such master's. And I thought it was silly, but still that was the requirement. And if you check the titles, if you want to do and if you want to pursue an academic career, for instance, let's say you want to become the dean of a school or the headmaster, whatever, you will probably need in some countries to have a specific degree. So for instance, I have noticed that in the UK, the deans of universities and colleges often are PhDs. So it seems to me that that's the route. And I was checking some job openings for other universities, and they were asking whether you had a PhD or a master. So for some universities, the best way to check that whether you're qualified seemed to be the paper trail. So again, I mean, to me, if an institution is checking for a paper trail as a, let's say, as a requirement, as a mandatory requirement, for me, we are talking about nonsense, but that's my personal opinion, of course. And the institutions have to draw the line somewhere, I guess, where to decide whether somebody is eligible or not. And if the line is drawn on paper, well, it's drawn on paper, then be it. That it means that you need a piece of paper to be eligible to work in a certain environment. So in that case, a degree is useful, I guess. But again, in the animation industry and in an animation studio, nobody never ever asked me for a degree. Unless maybe we were drunk at the pub and they asked me whether I had a degree or not. But that's, you see it yourself, that does not really mean anything, does it? Although it's funny to talk about that. Then in the chat again, we have that somebody from Italy is commenting, and I really like this comment. I have to translate it because otherwise English speaking people won't get it. It's a great comment, by the way. They say, it's true that in Italy, students are usually treated as inferiors to professors. And then there is this separation. I mean, the university system in Italy, historically, I think now it's getting a lot better, was separating students from professors. I mean, you wouldn't address a professor in class usually. You wouldn't really have a conversation with a professor. Even the space of the class had a certain visible gap between the professor and the students. And I mean, this goes to ridiculous length for which the dean of a university in Italy has some goes by some honorary titles like the magnificent dean of the university, the magnificent director of the university, which of course it makes you laugh because, I mean, magnificent, what does it even mean? So, but this kind of stuff, I mean, you have to see whether this magnificent rector of a university is indeed taking these things seriously, because maybe it's just a leftover of some ancient regulations. I mean, if you established a university in the 1200s, I imagine that you were indeed a magnificent individual, because it was pretty tough, I guess, to establish a university back then and to maintain it, especially considering the geopolitical situation. So, I mean, I guess there was reason to consider you an individual worthy of some respect. But if you filled up a job opening, and we are in the 21st century now, if you just went for a job opening and got your job, then magnificent is just some sort of stamp that you get with the job opening. It's just a role, just like in production there are supervisors, animation directors, and whatnot. I mean, air marshals, whatever you want to throw at somebody as a name. And you have to keep in mind that even in production, you may be given very curious roles. I mean, I worked in a production where at a certain point, people had the role of point of contact, and you were like, what am I, as a call center operator? I mean, what's going on? And these are roles, they mean nothing. They really mean nothing. They're just conventions, like saying you are the Pope. Okay, you're the Pope. But if imagine I were born in a nation where I never heard of Catholicism, for instance. If somebody comes to me dressed in a funny dress and tells me they're the Pope, and I have never heard of anything like that, for me, yeah, if you say so, whatever. What's your name, by the way? So it's title is what it is. It has a meaning within a context, within a framework. So again, professors, they go by the same rules. They have that title. It doesn't mean much necessarily. You have to measure them by the job they do and how well they do it, I guess. You can't even measure them by the students very often, because what if the students that day, they didn't sleep much the previous night, so they are not paying attention at the end of class, maybe they didn't learn anything. That's a possibility. Or maybe somebody studied on their own and they have a very good material prepared now, and they didn't even go to class, and they leave school and they say, you know what, I went to that school and that's my material. And somebody may think that their material is good because they came through that school. I mean, but again, you have to imagine that when I finished university myself, I did a lot of examinations in a very short amount of time, because in Italy you can do it, and I almost never had to go to class for most of those examinations. So I would show up on the day of the examination at uni and undergo whether the written test or the spoken test or both, based on what I studied on my own at home before that day. So you might well say, if all of a sudden it jumped out that I became very good at, I don't know, history of ancient books of the 14th century, for instance, you might well think that that's because of the university. Maybe, but maybe it's because I just studied it. It so happens that I went through the university though. So I think the value of a university is the network and the variety of teachings you are submitted to. In particular, Italian universities were great in my opinion, because I remember going there, and on my first day I didn't even know where I was supposed to go, and I just went into a class where they were discussing history of the Catholic Church. It was really interesting. I just sat down several such classes, but I wasn't even supposed to be there. And Italian universities used to be very open. It was a great experience in many ways, and a very difficult one, because you were really left to your own devices. University in the UK is a lot more organized. In fact, you're barely left alone as a student, I think, which has some advantages, of course, and some disadvantages. There is another comment in the chat that they say, that's a great point about working visa. We're talking about the immigration point system. The person who's writing is a US citizen, but they would like to work in Canada, and their university has a sister school in Canada. There you have it. So there is some utility there, but again, it has nothing to do with the actual quality of your work and what the industry wants. The industry may require at a certain point a diploma, because that makes it easier on them bureaucratically, but it doesn't mean you need one. It is true, however, that whenever you look for openings in animation, very often you find the company saying that you should have a diploma, a degree in animation or art or something similar to that. They write that. But you have to imagine that's not because that's a requirement. That's because this way they weed out the people who have no understanding whatsoever in art, and they just think they're good because maybe their friends told them so to encourage them, or their mother told them so, and they didn't really check the quality of their material against that of other people, for instance, of the professionals, for instance. So the company will write, you need to have a certain amount of experience and a degree. But that doesn't mean that if you go to them with a showreel which is really, really good, they won't consider you just because you don't have the degree. That's a laughable concept, I would say, unless, of course, behind that there were other issues, like, for instance, they need that for the immigration system, or they need that because maybe they need to, I don't know, they get funding if they hired people with degrees. I don't know. I don't think that's a thing. But, there may be reasons which we don't know about. That's something that can happen. So you cannot completely dismiss the idea of a degree. In my opinion, there are valuable reasons. And if I have to speak by experience, I have to say that I've been for about 3 years teaching at the same institution. in two different institutions concurrently, and I noticed how people who were working very well, who were very good at working with the feedback and keeping you abreast of their development of their work, they tended to become friends together. And when they left university, they started forming their own network, and they ended up working even in the same places, of course, because let's say you find yourself in a company, and that's a job you have taken, and all of a sudden in the company somebody says, we really need another animator because, I don't know, the one we had has a stomach ache and he can no longer come to us. Then maybe you can say, you know what, I know someone who's very good. And sure enough, you find someone from your network, and he's some of your friends from uni. And a lot of Pixar directors, for instance, they went through the same college and they used to be in the same class. The historical generation, I don't know how it goes now, but historically it used to be that way. So the university is a great place to meet people who are like-minded, for instance. And I think one of the disadvantages of me, for instance, leaving university is indeed that you don't build that network. So of course you're some sort of a lone wolf, and you have to make do on your own. And that's a limit, I guess, of going to uni but not building a network there. So there is a note in the chat. By the way, today we have some very good intervention. Thank you for the questions because they're really, really good. So somebody says that it's funny. So Keyframe Monkey says it's funny. They feel quite supported when studying animation at uni, but now working in the industry, they feel like they are getting more support. And that is the thing. I think you're striking a great deal of truth in there. And the thing is, we used to say that you learn more in 1 month in the university, in 1 month in a studio than 1 year in uni. And that's something that I often repeat to my students as well. And that's not to say that the uni is not good, but one thing is to be in a school where the school has to give you a variety of teachings and form you on a variety of subjects, because maybe you yourself are not even sure about the specialization, if you want to have a specialization at all, of course. And one thing is to go into the industry and sit down in a room where people are trying to solve a specific problem. Of course, everything that will be talked about in that studio room will be specifically aimed at solving that problem. So you will feel way more support because it's in our interest to finish that project. In fact, I'm a bit surprised that to hear that in a certain way, because some people have a very negative experience of the industry, for instance, and they don't feel supported. I guess it depends on what you mean by support. I have to say that the way I learned animation was essentially thanks to the support of my colleague in studios, those who shared their expertise, those I talked to, and I met mostly very good people around, and I would say that most of the people I met, they had something to teach me. And if there were an issue, it was maybe that I wasn't open enough to learn from other people. So Keyframe Monkey is on point in here. It's a very apropos comment in here. You are getting a lot of support as a junior in a company if there is time to give you support, because physically, if you're physically there, it's better, of course, because it's, if you think of it, it's in the industry, I'm getting blocked in here, stumped. It's in the interest of everybody involved that you become proficient and professional. Because if as a junior you don't perform, then it means that somebody has to babysit you. And if you don't learn day after day, then also the relationship you have with your colleagues is put under strain, because they need to make you aware that you're not performing, that you're not getting it. So how are they going to do it if you don't get it? So it's in their interest as well to teach you and to support you, and that's a great thing about animation. Otherwise, I mean, it's very sad to sit in a room and see someone struggle and see them on their own. I mean, especially if you realize they're struggling, it sucks. It's a very bad feeling. You want to help these people, and you want to be in an environment where this happens. I don't think it happens everywhere, because I think it depends on the amount of time you spent in the industry, which kind of company you are in, what's the stage of the company, what's the wave of that company, which kind of project, how much time there is. There is a number of variables, but I think it's a good thing, and it could happen indeed. At uni, the tutor can support you, but much depends on the experience of the tutor, on their teaching method, and whether there is a very specific problem to solve. General support is good, but general support can only go as far. I mean, you can learn something in a certain amount of time, or you can learn something in a much shorter amount of time. So, of course, support there, it depends on the validity of support depends on specificity. So, I would say thank you very much again for this comment. It was really on point. And then there is Jason saying, how big do I think that the skill gap between uni graduates and people that just start out in the industry as a junior? Oh, I see. Okay, so the question is whether I think that it would be better to start in the industry as a junior rather than to graduate from uni and start in the industry. I mean, would it be more beneficial to start in the industry or not, or to go through uni? And what's the gap between uni and junior in the industry? I think that's a great question, and it's a subject of much debate, I have to say, in the universities I teach at, and even in those I don't teach at, I presume, because the world is but a small village, I guess. So all in all, I think that there is a general understanding that a lot of universities struggle to meet industry standard. And that happens for a number of reasons, of course, and I don't know if I will have time to go through them, but that means that a lot of, and I don't know it directly very often, I just hear of it. For instance, I made some Udemy and Skillshare tutorials, and sometimes I read the reviews that come through, and somebody says that my tutorials, they compensate the education they get in university, because they feel like in university they don't get such specificity as they are in class. So there seems to be then a gap between certain universities and colleges and the industry world, for instance. But don't think this stops in here. So there is a gap in there to begin with, but it's very hard to say whether there is a specific uni that doesn't have that gap, or whether some unis do have that gap. But it's something that the industry also knows about. The industry is aware of the fact that there is a divide sometimes, or at least a lag between school system and industry. And that's the reason why in a lot of studios, especially the big ones, there are dedicated internal programs of education. I mean, you may be trained in a specific kind of animation or on a specific tool in a company. There is always an induction, although it's usually fairly shallow for the most part. But there are companies in which there are specific training going on, and I know firsthand of companies where they are trying to set up specific training because they realize that not only there may be a gap between the industry and schools, but there may be a gap between a studio and itself. So imagine, I mean, just to give you an idea, there used to be companies, and I'm sure there still are, who were very specialized in special effects, for instance, in animating vehicles or buildings crumbling down, this kind of stuff. And the first time they put their hands on projects where they had to animate monsters, for instance, and characters, they did struggle, and the people working in those companies, they struggled quite a lot, because all of a sudden they were required to do something fairly different in terms of animation without any training. So that automatically means that there is indeed the possibility of a gap even within the industry, as people get specialized in something because they always worked on a specific type of project, and they maybe are not so efficient in other tasks. So that is something to think about, and if the question is, is it better to go through uni or start as a junior? Well, the answer is it's impossible to answer. It's really impossible to answer. I don't know. I think you can get. I mean, if a uni, let's put it down this way. I think if I were in this situation for which I'm asking myself this question, I would say, okay, let's say that there's a uni that is supposed to form me as a professional animator, and it takes them 3 years to do so. If I can get to, and all I'm interested in is animated professionally, nothing else. If I can get to that stage of being able to animate professionally without those 3 years, then maybe that's a good solution. If the degree is of no importance to me, then in that case, it's probably better to go for a shorter course or just learn animation myself if I can. Maybe that's a solution. It's very hard for me to tell somebody don't go to uni, because of course, whether I liked it or not, or I found it of practical use or not, university did contribute to my formation, and I wouldn't be able to know where I would be without it. Maybe I would be here today anyway, or maybe I won't. I would not be able to be here. So it's very difficult to say. I would say that as far as the industry is concerned, it doesn't matter to them whether you come from a school or you learn the animation yourself, for as long as your showreel is good enough. So if your showreel is competitive in comparison to other showreels, I mean, if we look at your showreels and you can say, you know what, this looks like professional stuff, it's very good, then you might as well start as a junior without going to uni. So this is rather, I'm flipping the point of view to make sure I place myself in the position of the industry, for instance. So I'm thinking, okay, if the industry looks at this stuff, they won't care about the uni. Having said that, for instance, my girlfriend works in the industry and she hires people, and I know for a fact that if they read some specific names of schools in the CVs, very often they think maybe it's worth checking this person out. Mainly based on anecdotal experience and empirical experiences. They have seen other people with good showreels coming out of the same uni, so they think that maybe this person as well might be good. So that's another thing that happened. But there is definitely the possibility of a gap within unis and the industry, and I know of it because of comments to my courses online, for instance. So I think, well, maybe it's not there, but the students think there is. And I think at any rate that the industry moves at a certain pace, and it's very difficult for schools to keep up. I think it's not that easy. So of course there is bound to be a lag somewhere, and not in every school, of course. I think much depends on the school. It's very difficult to create a carpet statement for this. Then there is somebody's trying to get their foot through the door as a rigger. There is plenty of work around there are plenty of jobs around. I would really suggest, Martin, that you start talking to riggers. My suggestion is always go on LinkedIn and ask somebody who's already working as a rigger what do they think you should have as a showreel for that kind of job. And you will not everybody will answer, but some people will. And that's already a good starting point. Also check the showreels of people who just started, they are juniors, and see what they have in the showreel, and that will give you a pretty good idea of what's needed. I would say if you want to do rigging, you need to learn Python these days. I think it's really relevant because you want to automatize a lot of tasks. Then we have Hoodrat Paco is saying there is always a lot of mid to senior rigging jobs, but they haven't seen many junior rigging recently. They're also looking. So I keep repeating something that I heard from a rigger. So a rigger, I remember hearing a rigger saying once that a lot of people apply to a rigging position with full rigs of full characters. And while that's of course all good and well, when you are if you are applying for a job in a big company where there are already senior positions around, it's less likely that you will be given to rig a full-on character, because somebody else with more experience is going to do that probably. So you will be at the beginning probably be given smaller tasks to solve, and based on how you perform, you will be moved on to something more complex. And there is another thing about what they said, which is a lot of people, they do a tutorial, they follow a tutorial on rigging a full character, and the material, and in their showreel you have exactly the result, the same result they get from the tutorial. But that doesn't mean they can rig, it just means that they can follow a tutorial. Rigging is about solving a number of problems. For instance, how do we deform an object or a character in such a way that the performance in the viewport is real-time, for instance, or near real-time, so that the animator can animate? And how can we solve that issue so that the deformation is nice, aesthetically pleasing, and in line with art direction? So these are already two different problems. And then there is a third problem. How can we create a rig machine, a rig for which the animator finds it ergonomically convenient and efficient to animate? That's another problem to solve, for instance. And finally, can we automate this process somehow? So you see, we already have four different options there, and four different aspects that are very crucial to rigging, and then in my opinion they are often overlooked in showreels, because of course people tend to follow a tutorial and show you, look, I can rig a character. Yeah, okay, that's fair enough. That's the character maybe you were given for the tutorial, and that's the rig that the instructor told you to do, and you did that and it works. But it's how do we know you can solve another problem? So this rigger eventually said that maybe a good test to make is to rig a prop which is some articulation, some functions, and see how you solve that. Can you deliver something that works with nice deformations and then it's easy to animate? That's a good thing to showcase probably. But again, it's just one rigger I heard, so maybe I'm pretty sure there are other opinions. So I think as far as rigging is concerned, you do want to do some research in there. So let's see what else. We are going a bit off topic because we ended up talking about rigging quite a lot. Not that I mind. In fact, I think in the chat some very good points have been raised tonight. So thank you very much for joining me again. We are talking about school marks and degree mostly, but we divert every now and then. And if you have questions, you can ask them in English, Italian, or Spanish. It's just the same to me. Or rather, I mean Spanish. I mean, I'm not that fluent anymore, I think, but I can do something with that as well. So what else there is about marking? I don't think there is much to be said. I think we covered all of the subjects. I think you have to keep in mind that marks are something that institutions have put in place to kind of make it more systematic to rank people and to decide whether they're ready to go on to the second year or the third year of a university. But in themselves, school marks don't hold any value whatsoever for the industry. They just don't care. And then apart from that, there is a utility to marks and degrees, as in immigration points may be connected to the degree, for instance. And some schools may have better name than others, but I wouldn't quite count on it. And then scholarships may be tied to marks. In general, if you're really worrying about marks, you should also consider one thing. There is research that seems to prove that anybody taking decisions, even involving other human beings, is prone to give take more favorable decisions about the people involved if they are in a relaxed state, if they are well fed, and if they're not under stress or duress, of course. And this is actually, I think I want to put this on screen because I think it's fairly reasonable and it's certainly relevant to our topic. There was this study in which they were observing the sentences of parole judges who had to decide whether somebody could be granted freedom on parole or not. And the finding was that if the judge was just if the judge was deliberating, say right after lunch or right after a break, then 65% of people were granted the parole they were seeking. But the closer you got to the next break, and the less chances you got to get parole, because the judges were getting tired, they were getting under stress, so they just wanted to get over with it, and they were less lenient. So that means that, and this is a pretty high risk, high stakes situation. I mean, we're talking about people being granted freedom or not in here. I mean, it makes the difference between spending your next year maybe in a prison or outside the prison. So you could say that this situation is so important that you would expect the judge to be as objective as they can. But there is something called grade fatigue, so to speak, or in general fatigue. So that means that if even a tutor who's marking your work, say that, for instance, say that I receive 100 people to mark, 100 assignments to mark. If I go for them in a single go, boy, I'm pretty sure that by the end of it, I will be pissed off. And then my marks will go down and down proportionally to my level of stress, tiredness, and in general, annoyance. Maybe I want to have lunch now and I can't because I have to mark 100 people. So that means that in practice, you can't trust even the objectivity of marks. Me, in order to prevent myself from giving marks that are unjust, I actually have grids, Excel spreadsheets in which there are some objective aspects that I'm marking. And then of course I have also a subjective section, because there are people who are making an effort in particular, and that effort should be premiated. So you see, even, I mean, there is the fact that marks can't be necessarily reliable because of the fact that people get tired, the tutor gets tired, or maybe they had a bad day, for instance, and they weren't centered enough as not to have this thing affect their relationship with the students or their work. And then there are situations in which you want to mark the objective value of a work, but then you're also marking the fact that maybe this person was super shy and super withdrawn, for instance, and maybe they felt that they couldn't make it and they finally made it, and you are premiating not only the quality of the work but the quality of the effort. And there is an argument against the utilization of marks themselves as well. I mean, somebody, I think I have to find it somewhere, but somebody made a point for which if a mark is something the student has to look forward to, then the student mindset may turn from one of let's try and make the best and learn this thing and become excellent at this thing to let's try and get that mark. And once you unlock the system for which you can get a good mark, then you have no incentive whatsoever to learn what you're supposed to learn. And in the words of this person, the students might prioritize exam outcomes and thus incur in what they call moral hazards. That is, you're not learning anything anymore. You're just being trained to, by yourself or someone else, to pass the exam. And what use there is to it if the place where you're going to has no regards whatsoever to the exit of your exam. So that is also something that you have to keep in mind. The mark itself is there for the university and the school to somehow order their students into categories and decide whether a student has met the learning outcomes and whether the student is mature enough to move forward. But that's about it. I wouldn't stress it too much apart from that, unless you have a specific reason to be interested in the mark itself. Now, having said that, I think it's time for us to call it a night, and I would really like to sorry, I was reading the comments in the chat, and I would really like to go to the recommendations. And today I have a couple of recommendations, and one of them is actually a repetition of my previous recommendation, but what can we do? One recommendation is a book from 1906 from Hermann Hesse. The book is called The Prodigy. It used to be published, I think, as Beneath the Wheel. In German, I think it would be Untern Rad. I think that's the German translation. It's a very good book, although it's a very sad one as well. It's about this young kid who comes from a very small and poor village, but this person proves themselves good at school when they are very young. So of course the vicar and the headmaster and everybody around them is encouraging them to work harder and harder to meet the requirements to get a scholarship and thus access a boarding school. And truth be told, the kid is taught to meet those requirements in the most academic sense of the word. And what happens is that they study so much and so hard to meet these requirements that their whole life soon becomes full and packed with academic achievements, but in academic notions, but it stops there. Whereas the rest of life is neglected in favor of academic outcomes. And these prove to be detrimental to the mental health of the students, for instance. It is a very sad book. I read one review that said that it is not a bad book, they said, but it makes you want to kill yourself. By Jason, by the way. Jason is thanking in the chat. Thank you, Jason. Have a good night. So this is a great book to read if you can put your hands over it. I really suggest you spend some time reading it. And then, speaking of something a bit more light-hearted, then we have keep your hands off Eizouken. Keep Your Hands Off Eizouken is a great TV series, an animated one. It's made in Japan, but I think the animation director was actually European, and it talks about a bunch of young students in a Japanese school who form up an anime club with the purpose of producing animes. It is a great insight on how to produce animation in general and what are the challenges you face as someone who wants to produce animation. It's a lot of fun. You should really watch it. It's the second time I actually watch this series and recommend the series. I think it's great, and it's not serious at all. I mean, it is serious in a way because, of course, it is talking about true stuff, and this true stuff is represented in a fairly objective way. It also shows the relationship between the school and the students and how separated are the concerns that move the school against those that move the students. And now the students have to somehow navigate the school system to get to do what they want to do. How they have to leverage that student position in order to get what they want to do from the school, which is essentially support and resources. It is a great TV series. I really suggest you watch it. It's a lot of fun. You'll find the link in the description. So have a look at it, and I hope you will find enjoyable. It certainly was for me. And then there is in the chat Martin says it's their first time here and whether I do this more often. Martin, I do lives every Thursday at 5 p.m. UTC, and every now and then when I manage to catch somebody who's working in Japan in animation, I do lives on Sundays as well, usually at 1 p.m. UTC if I remember well, of course. So 5 p.m. UTC on Thursday is something that almost always happens unless I'm on holidays or I'm working on something and I did overtime and can't join for the stream. So thank you very much for the question. I think it was a good question, by the way, because I always forget to remember people about my lives. So having said that, I think we can call it a day, I guess. And please remember, if you found this chat useful, if you found this thing useful and you liked it, please remember to share it so that more people will join and we will have more contribution, and we can actually open some sort of conversation which maybe goes wider and wider the more we progress. So please remember to share and like and subscribe on YouTube and hit the notification bell, of course. And I guess I will close with the opening of Keep Your Hands Off Azoken. I won't be able to play many frames because otherwise Google will pull down the video, but this is the series. Have a look because it's a bit acid. The opening is a bit acid, but it's really a lot of fun. So I really suggest you have a look at it. Having said that, have a good night, and I will maybe see you next Thursday if you want to join me. Have fun. Thank you for joining me tonight, and thank you to everybody who commented because it was really a lot of fun to answer. Very good questions in the chat, I would say. Bye bye. Have a good night.